taken from home. The first reason it truly sucks to be a Jedi is that you never get to belong to your family or your world. From the earliest days of the Jedi Order, the practice has been to identify infants with Force sensitivity and take them away before they are old enough to form lasting attachments. This tradition was not treated as optional. Entire cultures across the Republic grew to expect it, and some worlds lived in quiet dread of the day a Jedi starship would descend, cloaked in the authority of the Council, to collect their most promising children. For the Jedi, this was framed as a benevolent necessity, but to the families who lost their sons and daughters, it was theft wrapped in ritual. Even when parents consented, it was under the heavy persuasion that their child's gift would become a curse if left untrained. The Jedi always insisted they knew best, but the truth is that countless families mourned the loss of children they would never see again, left only with the knowledge that their bloodline had been severed in service of a distant order they could never touch. From the child's perspective, it meant being uprooted before understanding the meaning of choice. The first memories of a Jedi youngling are not of home or kin, but of the temple's walls on Coruscant, vast and impersonal, where every corner is designed to enforce discipline rather than nurture. Those who were too young to even recall their parents grew up never knowing the warmth of a mother's embrace or the stories of a father's people. For them, identity was erased at the root. The Jedi did not encourage remembrance of origin or lineage. Surnames were discarded, native customs suppressed, cultural languages discouraged, all so that the child would identify not with their people but with the order alone. In exchange for family, they were given routine, meditation at dawn, endless lectures on the dangers of emotion, and drills that demanded precision before imagination. Their childhoods were standardized, regimented, and controlled, all to ensure no spark of individuality could outshine the collective discipline of the Jedi way. It is tempting to say that this was training for greatness, but the price was steep. The Jedi Code taught that attachment led to fear, fear to anger, anger to hate, and hate to suffering. That chain of logic was recited so often it became mantra, etched into every child's mind. The result was an emotional vacuum, a forced suppression of the very bonds that define sentient life. Where a normal child might cry out for comfort after nightmares, a Jedi youngling was expected to meditate until the fear passed. Where a child might laugh too loudly, they were gently corrected, told to find serenity. The order conditioned them to see natural expressions of humanity as flaws that needed restraint. This robbed them of something fundamental, the ability to grow in the messy, beautiful chaos of family and childhood. The harshest truth is that not every youngling was destined to succeed. Those who failed to meet the order's standards were quietly reassigned into service branches like the Agricultural Corps, sent to the far reaches of the Republic to use their abilities on crops and terraforming projects rather than in lightsaber combat. While useful to society, this was treated as a mark of failure within the temple. To be diverted from the path of the Jedi Knight was to be forgotten, to be discarded from the collective memory of your peers. Younglings who struggled with concentration or combat technique grew up under the constant shadow of inadequacy, fearing they would one day be told they were unfit and banished from the life they had been forced into. Stripped from their families, they could not return home. Stripped from the order, they had nowhere left to belong. Even those who did excel paid the cost. They were bonded not to family but to the Jedi Masters who raised them in small clans within the temple, surrogate groups that emphasized discipline over intimacy. Any friendships that grew too strong were quietly discouraged. The council feared that deep bonds could lead to favoritism or attachment, which in their view was the seed of corruption. So the closest thing to family a Jedi child ever had was always under scrutiny, always subject to the risk of separation should it prove too affectionate. This was not love, it was conditioning disguised as community. There is a cruelty in how the Order justified this cycle. They believed that taking children early prevented dangerous attachments later in life, ensuring loyalty to the code rather than to family or passion. But what it truly produced were orphans by design, young beings stripped of their roots and expected to carry the weight of an ideal so heavy that even masters stumbled beneath it. The tragedy of Anakin Skywalker underscores this. Taken later than most, he carried with him memories of his mother, Shmi, memories that became attachments the Council feared and tried to suppress. His love for her became grief when she died, and that grief became the seed of his downfall. Yet what is often forgotten is that his downfall was not born from some unnatural flaw, but from the most natural of desires, to love and to protect one's family. The Jedi solution was to sever that instinct at the source by taking children too early to remember. To be a Jedi meant never truly knowing where you came from and never being allowed to long for it. The temple became your cradle, your school, your world. It may have trained warriors of unmatched skill, but it also created generations of beings who had been robbed of the simple right to grow within their families, to inherit their cultures, to choose their paths. For every heroic act the Jedi Order performed, it was built upon the sacrifice of countless stolen childhoods. This first step, separation from home, was the foundation of every suffering that followed. Before they even held a lightsaber, before they took their oaths, before they marched into wars not of their making, every Jedi began life as an exile, torn from their roots and forced into a destiny they did not choose. And it is in that exile that the true cost of being a Jedi begins. Forged into soldiers. If being taken from home was the first wound of a Jedi's life, the second was the forging that followed, because the Order did not raise children in the way most civilizations understand. It trained them as soldiers from the moment they could walk. The Jedi spoke of peace, of guardianship, of serenity, yet every exercise inside the temple and every lesson from a master prepared them for conflict. From the time they were younglings, the halls of the temple rang not with laughter, but with the hum of training sabers clashing. The children were sorted into clans and drilled daily in lightsaber forms, acrobatics, and advanced combat techniques. To the galaxy, they were supposed to be diplomats and mediators, but within their walls they were taught from the start that violence was inevitable and that their role was to master it with precision. Their playtime was sparring, their game strategy exercises, their textbooks filled not with stories of wonder, but with codices on the history of warfare and the dangers of the dark side. The Jedi Code insists that there is no emotion, there is peace. Yet the Order's training contradicted its own words. They told children to embrace serenity while placing them into tournaments that measured their aggression, speed, and skill with weapons. Younglings who faltered were corrected sharply, told that failure in the temple meant death on the battlefield, as though war was an unquestioned destiny. The council preached detachment, but immersed its children in constant reminders that combat defined their worth. For initiates who dreamed of diplomacy or scholarship, this environment crushed imagination. For those who loved the physical challenge, it reinforced the idea that their value was measured in duels and battlefield efficiency. Either way, individuality bent beneath the weight of expectation, and every Jedi child was pushed toward becoming a warrior long before they could even grasp the meaning of peace. When a Padawan was finally chosen by a knight or master, the transformation deepened. What should have been mentorship often became a form of militarized apprenticeship. Padawans accompanied their teachers into missions that frequently turned violent. They were told to observe, but soon became participants, holding their own in skirmishes that killed soldiers many years older than themselves. An adolescent who should have been discovering who they were in safety instead faced blaster fire, lightsabers, and the screams of the dying. Jedi were proud of their apprentices, calling them talented, promising, wise, but what they really were was children thrown into war. The Clone Wars magnified this cruelty. Padawans as young as 14 were sent into campaigns where entire battalions depended on their leadership, commanding legions of clone soldiers who saw them as generals. A teenager could give orders that condemned hundreds of men to die, all while suppressing the guilt because the Jedi Code demanded it. This militarization bled into every aspect of their identity. The Jedi forbade attachment, yet they allowed, even encouraged, bonds with the clones they commanded, only to expect them to endure the betrayal of Order 66 without breaking. They taught compassion, yet ordered their Padawans to send soldiers into unwinnable fights. They insisted they were guardians of peace, yet functioned as generals in a galaxy-spanning war. The hypocrisy was not lost on the young. Some, like Ahsoka Tano, began to question whether the Order's teachings aligned with its actions. When the Jedi could not reconcile the contradiction, the apprentices were left to shoulder the confusion and trauma alone. The forging process also demanded obedience, crushing dissent under the weight of tradition. If a young Jedi questioned orders, they were told it was pride. If they showed anger, it was corruption. If they admitted fear, it was weakness. The code was absolute, and any deviation was met with reprimand. This relentless pressure to suppress natural emotions did not make Jedi calm. It made them repressed. Many carried inner turmoil that never healed because they were forbidden to acknowledge it. Those feelings festered, making them vulnerable to the very darkness they were warned about. Anakin Skywalker, again, is the clearest example. Trained to suppress his love for his mother and later for Padme, he internalized guilt and fear until Sidious exploited it. But Anakin's tragedy was not an isolated flaw. It was the logical result of a system that told children to be weapons but denied them the chance to be human. The harsh physical demands of training also left scars. Jedi conditioning rivaled that of elite soldiers, requiring mastery of acrobatics, lightsaber katas, and advanced martial arts. Broken bones, burns from, training sabers, and exhaustion were considered routine. Masters demanded perfection, reminding initiates that on the battlefield, imperfection meant death. Meditation was prescribed not as healing but as discipline, another layer of pressure to conform to an impossible standard. This relentless cycle created warriors who could withstand incredible pain, but also individuals who had never been allowed to experience failure as growth, only as shame. The warlike training shaped the galaxy's perception of Jedi as much as it shaped the Jedi themselves. Civilians looked at them and saw serene guardians of peace. But behind that image were traumatized adolescents and battle-hardened young adults carrying burdens too heavy for their years. The Order concealed its own cruelty behind platitudes, insisting that training was discipline and discipline was freedom. Yet in truth, it bound its members to a life of endless combat readiness, where every breath was preparation for a war they had no choice but to fight. Being forged into a soldier from childhood robbed Jedi of innocence, of the right to grow at their own pace, of the ability to discover passions beyond combat. It created generations of beings who were both admired and pitied, admired for their skill, pitied for their lost humanity. And while the galaxy revered them as heroes, the truth is that most Jedi never had the chance to be anything other than soldiers pressed into service by an order that claimed to value peace but trained exclusively for war. Forbidden to love. If the first wound of a Jedi's life is being taken from family, and the second is being remade into a soldier, then the third is the permanent denial of love. The Jedi Code forbids attachment in all its forms. Family ties, romantic love, even friendships that might grow too strong. The justification is always the same. Attachment leads to fear, fear to anger, anger to hate, and hate to suffering. That mantra is drilled into the mind of every initiate until it becomes reflex. But while the Council claimed this prohibition was the safeguard that kept Jedi pure, in reality it condemned them to a life of loneliness, a life where the most fundamental of sentient needs, the need to bond, to belong, to love, was treated as a dangerous flaw. From their earliest years in the temple, younglings were warned against forming deep bonds. They could spar together, laugh in the refectories, even share jokes and rivalries, but anything resembling closeness beyond camaraderie was frowned upon. Masters kept a careful eye on the friendships of initiates, discouraging anything that suggested favoritism or dependence. The intention was to prevent loss from destabilizing a Jedi, but the effect was to leave them isolated even among their peers. No matter how many brothers and sisters in arms they trained beside, every Jedi was reminded that their true loyalty could only be to the Order and to the abstract ideal of peace. The heart was never allowed to claim another person as its own. This repression grew harsher as Padawans matured. Adolescents, naturally drawn toward intimacy and affection, were instead forced to deny it, to meditate through their longings until they dulled. For some, this created a numb detachment from others. For many, it created secret guilt as they wrestled with feelings they could not extinguish. There was no safe space to talk about desire, no outlet for yearning. Confession of love to a master was dangerous. At best, it would be met with stern correction. At worst, it could be interpreted as a sign of instability and a mark against the Padawan's readiness for knighthood. So feelings were hidden, buried beneath layers of secrecy, festering until they became vulnerabilities. This hypocrisy meant that Jedi were supposed to embody serenity, yet many lived with unacknowledged storms inside. Romantic love was the sharpest prohibition. Jedi were taught that to fall in love was to invite destruction. Anakin Skywalker's story is the most famous example, but it was not unique. He was trained to suppress his love for his mother, and when she died in his arms, the grief became unbearable precisely because he had never been taught how to cope with loss. Later, when he loved Padme Amidala, he carried that love in silence, knowing it was forbidden. That secrecy twisted affection into obsession, and obsession into fear of losing her. Sidious exploited that fear to corrupt him, but the root lay in the Jedi Code itself. It denied him the tools to love openly, honestly, and healthily. By branding love as weakness, the Jedi ensured that when it inevitably emerged, it came cloaked in guilt and vulnerability. Nor was Anakin alone. Throughout the Order's history, there were countless whispers of Jedi who loved in secret, some who hid families, some who broke under the strain, some who left the Order entirely. Ahsoka Tano's bond with Anakin and her growing disillusionment after being betrayed by the Council showed another kind of love, the love of trust, the love of belonging. When that trust was shattered, she walked away, proving that even friendship and loyalty, when dismissed as dangerous attachment, became reasons for Jedi to break. The irony is that Jedi were asked to serve as guardians of people, yet they were forbidden to form the very bonds that would give them empathy for those people. They were supposed to protect families while never being allowed to have one. The hypocrisy reached even deeper when compared to other Force traditions. The Sith embraced passion, wielding it as power. The Night Sisters of Dathomir built bonds of family and sisterhood into their magic. Even the Mandalorians, rivals of the Jedi, saw family ties as sacred to their culture. Only the Jedi, who claimed to embody balance and peace, demanded that their members live without the basic intimacy of love, and in doing so, they created individuals who might be wise and powerful, but who often struggled with understanding the very beings they swore to protect. There is also a cruelty in how Jedi were expected to face death. When a comrade or master fell, grief was to be replaced by serenity, loss acknowledged but not lingered on. Jedi funerals were brief, their code teaching that life becomes one with the Force and therefore should not be mourned, but the absence of mourning is not the absence of pain. For many Jedi, grief had no outlet. They learned to stand still at the funerals of their brothers and sisters, repressing sobs into silence. Some mastered that silence, but others broke beneath it. To live a life where love is forbidden is to live a life where every loss must be swallowed whole, never voiced, never shared. This prohibition also created a deep paradox in the Jedi's role. They were meant to embody compassion and care for all beings, yet they could not express that care personally. They were expected to fight wars for the Republic, to lead legions of clones whose camaraderie became unshakable, yet they could not return that loyalty in full, because to form attachment was against their code. When Order 66 came, many Jedi died, not only because the clones betrayed them, but because they had never been allowed to fully trust the men they led. They loved them in secret, but could never say it, and that silence became another wound when the betrayal fell. To forbid love is to forbid joy, intimacy, and belonging. For a Jedi, it meant living a life of isolation, carrying burdens alone, repressing feelings until they either withered into numbness or exploded into tragedy. It meant never having the right to be vulnerable, never having the freedom to give yourself completely to another. In the name of peace, the Jedi traded away their hearts, and in doing so, they lost not only their humanity, but the very balance they sought to protect. Shackled by the code, if the Jedi were wounded first by being taken from home, then forged into soldiers and forbidden to love, the chains that bound them most tightly were the unyielding rules of their code. The Jedi Code was meant to be a compass, a guiding light that kept its followers from falling into darkness, but in practice it became a set of shackles that stripped them of choice and individuality. Every aspect of their lives was governed by rigid doctrine: when to meditate, how to speak, how to feel, how to act. Freedom, the very thing they were sworn to defend in the Republic, was denied to them within their own order. They were told from their first breath in the temple that there was no emotion, no passion, no self, only the serene service of an ideal. It sounds noble in theory, but in practice it robbed Jedi of agency, forcing them to betray their own nature again and again. The code demanded detachment from all things. A Jedi was not permitted to own possessions beyond their lightsaber, a robe, and basic tools of survival. While others across the galaxy cherished heirlooms, treasured art, or family mementos, Jedi were instructed to reject such ties. To carry anything that symbolized individuality was dangerous, for it might anchor them too closely to identity and memory. This stripped them of the anchors that make life meaningful. Their entire identity became service, their worth measured by discipline and obedience. Even their lightsabers, the one possession they crafted with their own hands, were never truly personal. They were symbols of the Order first, tools to be surrendered or destroyed if required by duty. The Jedi lived as ascetics not because they chose it, but because they were never allowed to choose otherwise. The Jedi were also bound by their council's decrees, a body of masters whose word was law. There was no room for dissent, no culture of debate that allowed true freedom of thought. Those who questioned orders were branded reckless or arrogant, even when history proved them right. Qui-Gon Jinn embodied this tension. He believed in following the will of the living force over the rigid dogma of the council, but for his independence he was often marginalized, denied a seat among the masters despite his wisdom. His defiance highlights the paradox. Those who fought freely were punished, and those who obeyed blindly were praised, even when blind obedience led the Order into disaster. Anakin Skywalker, too, chafed under these restrictions. When he spoke against council rulings, they called him dangerous. When he asked for trust, they gave him surveillance. The code promised wisdom, but in reality, it smothered individuality under tradition. Perhaps the most devastating aspect of the code was how it manipulated morality. Jedi were expected to be peacekeepers, but in truth, they became soldiers of the Republic, forced to kill and destroy while still reciting mantras about peace. They were ordered to lead armies, yet they were denied the freedom to question whether the war itself was just. Many Jedi knew they were pawns in political games, but were trapped by duty. They told themselves they were defending peace, but their actions contradicted their ideals, and the code offered no escape from this hypocrisy. The doctrine bound them to a rigid notion of justice, even when that justice demanded compromise with corrupt senators or blind loyalty to institutions rotting from within. In the end, the Jedi served not the living force, but the bureaucracy of the Republic, because the code left them powerless to refuse. The shackles extended even into the inner life of every Jedi. The code taught that anger, fear, and grief were all dangerous emotions that led to the dark side. Rather than teaching healthy ways to cope with them, the Jedi demanded suppression. A knight was expected to show serenity at all times, even when confronted with the horrors of war, even when watching comrades fall. To show grief was weakness, to express anger was failure, to desire justice too strongly was corruption. This repression did not erase emotion, it buried it deep where it festered. Jedi who broke under the weight of this repression were branded traitors or fallen, blamed for their own collapse, when in truth the Order had never allowed them to be human in the first place. The most tragic proof of the Code's tyranny came in the final days of the Republic. When Palpatine revealed himself as a Sith Lord, the Jedi knew the Republic had been manipulated into war by their greatest enemy, yet they did not expose him to the Senate. They did not seek the will of the people. Bound by doctrine and secrecy, they chose to act as executioners, deciding in closed chambers to depose the Chancellor without trial, the code that had taught them to suppress. Individuality now taught them to usurp democracy because they believed only they could interpret the will of the Force. This decision, born of rigid doctrine, sealed their fate. When Order 66 came, the Jedi were not seen as protectors, but as traitors plotting against the Republic. Their shackles had led them to their own destruction. The irony is that the code was supposed to protect the Jedi from corruption, but in truth it made them fragile. Because they had no room to feel, no room to question, no room to choose. They had no resilience when challenged. The Sith promised freedom, passion, individuality, and to a Jedi repressed since childhood, that promise was intoxicating. Many who fell did so not out of malice, but out of desperation to feel alive again. The code, in its rigidity, created the very enemies it sought to prevent. To live as a Jedi meant living a life in chains. Every desire was forbidden, every emotion dangerous, every choice bound by doctrine. They preached freedom while embodying control, preached peace while waging war, preached wisdom while silencing dissent. The code was their scripture, but it was also their prison. And for all the galaxy's reverence of the Jedi Order, within their hearts many Jedi carried the silent truth, that their lives had never been their own, and that the shackles of the code made them servants not of peace, but of a doctrine that denied them the very humanity they swore to protect, doomed to fall. When viewed together, the wounds of a Jedi's life form not just hardship but inevitability, a pattern so rigid and self-destructive that collapse was written into the Order's foundation. Taken from their homes as children, stripped of family, forged into weapons, denied love, and shackled by the code, the Jedi lived in a system that made their downfall certain. Their own choices, their own rigid doctrines, and their own blindness ensured that when the storm finally came, they were powerless to stop it. To be a Jedi was not simply to live with burden, it was to be doomed from the start. The clearest evidence of this inevitability lies in the final years of the Republic. By then, the Jedi had become generals, leading vast armies of clones across the galaxy. They were peacekeepers turned warlords, their sabers no longer symbols of mediation, but of battle command. The Council sat not as neutral guardians of the Force, but as strategists in a galactic conflict orchestrated by their greatest enemy. The tragedy is that many of them knew this. Masters like Yoda sensed the dark side clouding everything, felt the pull of manipulation beneath the surface, but still they obeyed the Senate, still they fought a war they could not win. They had no alternative because their code had left them no room for it. Bound to obedience, bound to loyalty to institutions rather than the living force, they marched themselves and their apprentices into disaster. Palpatine did not destroy the Jedi alone. He merely pressed on the cracks that already ran through their foundation. He exploited the Order's fear of attachment to turn Anakin Skywalker into Darth Vader. He exploited their rigid obedience to draw them deeper into the Clone Wars. He exploited their secrecy to convince the galaxy they were traitors. The Jedi could not see these manipulations clearly because they were blinded by their own arrogance. They believed themselves incorruptible, their code flawless, their path unquestionable. This arrogance was not pride in the sense of boasting, it was pride in the sense of blindness, a refusal to admit they could be wrong. That blindness made them brittle. When tested, they shattered. The Order's insistence on detachment left them unable to understand the very beings they were sworn to protect. Ordinary citizens valued family, love, passion, and loyalty, yet the Jedi denied all of these things. While the people of the Republic saw life as a tapestry of connections, the Jedi lived in isolation, looking down upon the attachments of others as dangerous indulgences. This created distance, even distrust. When the Jedi finally acted against Palpatine, attempting to arrest him, the Senate and the people did not rally to their side. To them, the Jedi were aloof mystics and secretive generals, not relatable guardians. They had lost the trust of the Republic long before Order 66, so when the clones turned on their generals, there was no uprising to defend them, no protest to shield them, no loyalty returned for centuries of sacrifice. The galaxy watched the Jedi burn and did nothing, because the Jedi had spent centuries teaching that they were separate from everyone else. For the Jedi themselves, doom came not only from outside betrayal, but from within. The life of a Jedi was one of endless suppression, no family, no love, no emotion, no choice. When those suppressed desires and feelings finally broke free, they often did so explosively, in ways that consumed the individual. The dark side did not claim Jedi because they were weak. It claimed them because they had been forced to deny their humanity until they broke. Anakin's fall is the most famous, but it was not unique. Count Dooku left the Order because he grew disillusioned with its servitude to a corrupt republic. Many others faltered or disappeared, their stories forgotten, their lives marked as cautionary tales rather than symptoms of a broken system. The Jedi produced greatness, yes, but they also produced tragedy after tragedy, because their structure left no room for healthy imperfection. Even the survivors of the Purge could not escape this doom. Yoda, exiled on Dagobah, admitted in his final years that the Jedi had failed, that their ways had blinded them to the truth. Obi-Wan Kenobi, one of the Order's most loyal servants, was left a hermit, haunted by guilt over Anakin and crushed beneath the weight of loss. They were not exceptions. They were the natural outcomes of lives spent in denial and servitude. Survival did not free them. It left them with scars too deep to heal. What makes the Jedi's fall so painful is that it was never just the work of the Sith. Yes, the Sith struck the final blow, but the Jedi handed them the blade. Their rigidity made them vulnerable. Their fear of love made them manipulable. Their arrogance made them blind. Their servitude to the Republic made them pawns. And their refusal to adapt made their extinction inevitable. To be a Jedi meant not only living with hardship, but living on borrowed time, waiting for the moment when the flaws of the Order would catch up to you. The Jedi spoke often of balance, of harmony, of peace, yet they built a system that destroyed balance in the lives of their own members, forbade harmony in their attachments, and ensured that peace was always just out of reach. They created warriors without homes, protectors without families, servants without freedom, and guardians without joy. And when the end came, it was not only the galaxy that lost the Jedi Order, it was the Jedi themselves who lost everything, because their lives had been bound to a destiny they never chose and a code they could never escape. To live as a Jedi was to live a life where doom was certain, a path that promised glory but delivered only sacrifice. From the moment they were taken from their families, the story of a Jedi was not one of freedom but of inevitability, a march toward an ending written before they ever held a lightsaber. To be a Jedi, for all the legends and reverence, meant living a life that sucked, not in fleeting moments, but in every breath. Every burden, every unchosen step until the Order collapsed and its survivors were left only with silence, exile, and the ghosts of all they had lost.